And welcome back to another episode of Underground Antics. Today is a very special guest. It's one of my favorite people. It's the wonderful Bill Tibbo. Thank you for joining me.
Well, my pleasure, Shane.
Now, Bill, you have a very interesting job. Not many people in the world do what you do to some degree. And, so for anyone who's listening, essentially what part of your work is, you're a social worker and a registered psychotherapist by training, but you've spent the last several decades working in disaster management. And what that means, as far as I understand it, is when there are disasters either on a personal or like a family or a group level, you're the guy, you and your team are the guys who get called in to triage, to manage, and to help people process how to go through a massive change that happens, like when there's a crisis. And I know that you guys did work on, you've done like 9/11 project, you did that, you worked on various natural disasters and hurricanes, forest fires, you do a lot of work with the police and first responders and things like that, but you also have a very thriving clinical practice where you manage this on a one-to-one basis. And so today, we're going to discuss basically how change happens for people and how disaster and crisis is inevitable for just about everyone, and that it's a part of life, and that navigating through that change and knowing how to do it is a really essential part of, how could we say, finding the silver lining, learning the lessons, getting the best of both worlds, so to speak. Does that sound about right to you?
It does. I think it's probably it represents very well the way I think, and I think the way I perceive the world has been shaped by the experiences that I've been part of and the people I've met. So I would say, yeah, I'm very much a silver lining observer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, it must be very difficult in one sense what you do, because you spend a huge amount of your time triaging and debriefing with the individuals or the families or the corporations who have gone through a massive disaster of any kind, right? And during those times, people obviously have their lives uprooted, and they, don't know how to necessarily process what's happened, how to deal with it, how to move forwards into the future. So I'm wondering, like, obviously people react differently, right? Like different people, different personalities, different temperaments. They handle change very differently. In your work, like, how have you found that to be most obvious?
Well, if we're talking about those whom we've been able to assist and support, I think that your point's a very good one. One of the points that's important to understand, and it's truly applicable right now, is that the people whom we might engage with might not necessarily ever come to see a person like myself. For the most part, their lives are working along in a pretty nice rhythm, and they've done and paid attention to the things that they need to. So, for example, these might be people who economically are doing really well. They might be in very significant positions in corporations, or in sport, or in the movie industry. It could be anything, any particular profession. So they're doing well that way. They may have done a good deal of work in terms of shaping and maintaining good relationships, either with spouses and partners or with their kids and so on. What the world of disaster taught me is that it can strike anybody. And the very moment it strikes us, it doesn't necessarily mean, obviously, that we're incapable people or that we're weak people. But when the disaster strikes us, it really does oftentimes strip us of some of the most important resources, and it tests us in ways that, for the most part, none of us have ever been tested before. I'm always aware, and
Right.
answering your question in a very roundabout way. I've always been aware that the average individual, at least in our country, who would be a second generation Canadian and beyond, where they might not have come from war-torn communities and things like that. When you speak with them around 75 years of age, they'll tell you if they identify crises in their lives, they'll probably highlight two, maybe three. So this is not something that we're really practiced at. Now, there are going to be some situations where people, work in emergency services, or they work, as medical doctors and nurses, or they work in my field. So we can't say that. But the average person, that's the case. So there are attributes
Mm-hmm.
or qualities in the individual that come out, and attributes and qualities that come out in that individual's social and support network that have never really had to be tapped into before. Pardon me, and that's
Right.
where
It's a
I
real
discover
test.
so much about the influence that crisis has on people, but also more importantly, the silver lining and all of those things that
Mm-hmm.
evolve after the crisis has struck that can be pretty, it sounds odd, but eye-opening and almost heartwarming.
Right. It is a really strange, I don't know if strange is the right word, but often, as you say, like the most difficult situations that come up in people's lives can have the most profound positive benefit after the fact. During it's rough and it's chaos and emotions are flying, but the greatest lessons and that things, I mean, the silver lining, like what comes out of it is often, good. Not that it's to justify the crisis, but that, well, it's happened now. It has happened. It's most of the time beyond your control. Life or the universe created this event, and it's had this huge impact on you. And this applies also at smaller levels. Like losing your job or having a breakup or something like that, where at the time it does feel terrible and it seems like it's like very unstable and unknown. But through that, as you say, you're forced to find those resources within yourself and within your social community that can lead to some sort of positive change. And often people just identify this retrospectively because at the time it's hard to gain perspective on it, right? And so excuse me, like last week I had someone on and we spoke about how Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor, how he, changed the lives of so many people through his work. But that would only have happened had he gone through what he went through during the war and during the Holocaust. And so from that, so many people's lives have been forever altered for the better. But that did come as a consequence of him spending 4 years in a concentration camp, right? And so it is a weird balance of trying to find where that positive lining is, right? And I think that like right now with like the COVID situation, we're still like in the heat of it, right? And so what happens, how do you help people when the crisis is still going on, when it's not like this happened and now we're figuring out how to move through, right? At the moment, like we're in the middle of like an ongoing problem, right? And so how do you what do you teach or coach people into dealing with the crisis today? How does that
Well,
work?
you're asking a couple of different questions and
Yeah,
raised a
sorry.
couple of different points. And I'm going to try and answer your last question if I can in just a moment. But there is something critical about what you just talked about. And it has to do with the evolution that people see themselves go through. And it's not just themselves, but we talk about their social network. Sometimes it's their business, sometimes it's their industry. And and I'll use this term purposely, we get blindsided by crisis. We don't anticipate that it's coming. Most often, what makes a crisis is that it is a surprise to us. And so
Right.
some of the resources that we have internally, or as we've said before, in the network around us, they haven't surfaced. We haven't actually even noticed that they were there because none of those have really had to be used prior to. And so I've had several experiences where that has occurred. And I would probably say, Shane, eventually we're going to get to it, as to what it is that kind of keeps me relatively healthy. And I guess my wife would have an opinion about whether I am or I'm not here in this situation, but is because I understand that I'm going to see, um, in most cases, the better part of people when we're going through these crises. And I'll see how people come together as groups and how people will come together as corporations. And I've seen this, and we'll talk about this, throughout the COVID circumstance as well. You know, it's rare,
Mm-hmm.
but we've seen an awful lot of resource surface. Um,
Of
I
course,
think
yeah.
it's critical that we kind of address that, because that would be something that I always know is on the horizon. And so I'm not going to be obtuse enough to say to someone, well, hang on, once we get through this crisis, your retrospective view of this will be glorious, because it's not glorious. Because with every crisis, there's
Right.
loss. But with every loss, there's sometimes some gain and some insight that's delivered. Being a maritimer, I'm very anecdotal, so I'll have a tendency to give an account or two. And I, I woke up this morning, and this is a perfect example of
Yeah.
resources coming together and how it is that where people focus and so on. So there's a woman I've had the privilege, the honor, I'm going to say, of working with over the past year and a half. And she's only about 51 years of age. She is, I don't know that I've seen tenacity like this in my life, but
Hmm.
she's been through a good deal in her own personal life, in her relationship. Um, in that particular family, money is never an issue. That's not the struggle at all. But she, about a year and a half ago, she was touched by breast cancer. And the cancer, unfortunately, has evolved quite significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been working with her, trying to provide whatever support I can, and with her two kids. And this past week, she had to go for an MRI, and she subsequently was rushed into surgery where she had to have brain surgery as well. So things have just
Hmm.
spread. Excuse me. So, of all of this, you're thinking, okay, what's the silver lining Bill's going to pull out of this? Or more importantly, what's the silver lining that she pulls out of it when we have the discussion? Well, it was within,
Right.
I'd say, an hour of her being told that she had these brain tumors and that she was going to undergo emergency surgery. And she's got an 18-year-old and she's got a 16-year-old. Wonderful, wonderful kids who rely on her. And what happened is her entire family, extended family, sisters and so on, surrounded her very quickly. The friendship network that she's developed internationally, because she's relatively well known, surrounded her very quickly. And they started to communicate on her behalf with one another, getting reports back, providing support to the kids, um, supply, providing support to her. I got a message this
Mm-hmm.
morning, and she's still not communicating, but her sister is, of all of the things that transpired over the last few days in support of her and in support of the kids.
Yeah.
And here's why it's so cool. She has spent a lifetime being of support to others. Always that kind of an
Right.
individual who would do for others and didn't always receive. But in this situation, she knew she had to. So, a couple silver lines. One, those people who've been in her circle of support internationally have met one another. The kids understand how vast that is. They understand how important she
Right.
is to everybody. She is reminded of how much she's loved. And if one can deal with a crisis and be surrounded with that knowledge, that's pretty good. I mean, that doesn't wash away the
Right.
fact that she's got cancer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not that obtuse.
Of course,
But
yeah.
she's not alone. And she'll
Mm-hmm.
know very, very, very clearly that she'll never be alone. And her kids won't be alone. So can you understand the way I
Yeah.
think? I don't know whether that as
Yeah.
well with.
No, you're right. And it's remarkable how a crisis will transform a group or a community to, come together to deal with whatever needs to be done. And particularly when there's, love involved and people are doing it. Well, I mean, people do it for people they love, but they also do it for people that they don't know a lot of the time, right? And it seems to me that, like, when, not all the time, but hopefully when a crisis does happen, everyone who can and who's involved, they shift gears into this, like, it's like a different way of being where, the past history and any, like personal quarrels or judgments or anything like that, that shit all just falls away. And it's just about, like, okay, this is serious. Like, I'm just, how can I help you, or what do you need? Or even if they don't even ask that, it's like they get together and they figure out a plan. I mean, I can see it like here, in my own like community, where when someone like gets COVID or something like that, all of the friends and things like that, like particularly if it hits a family, they all just, like, before you know it, it's like everyone's cooking meals for the family for the next 2 weeks, right? Just like that. And I'm like, who organized this? And no one really knows, but everyone's got their designated day and their meal and whatever it is, and they do it and they drop it outside, or, a safe transfer. I mean, and that's like on a much lesser level. And then, but when people die, like in the Jewish community, there's a lot of that, where people will just bring food. I mean, I don't know why that's the way to go, but I guess it's like so that they don't have to worry about cooking and things like that. The mourners can just sit and, do their thing. But there is definitely like a sense of when the people come together, it is beautiful. And now it's like a beautiful in tragedy, right? Like, as you say, there's not to discount the pain or the suffering of it, but it is a reality of life. Everyone gets sick, everyone dies, and that's just how it goes.
I had
And contending with that, is difficult. And that, I think, where you're very well suited to what you do is you do have this natural optimistic view about life, right? And you'll go in and you'll be like, this is bad, but how can we transform this, or where do we find that silver lining, that good that can come from this? How do we help people get back to a place of potentially even a stronger place of, approaching life and dealing with things?
I think it's a very, very fundamental core belief that's existed from the time I was young. And
Right.
I do run the risk of, I don't know, being criticized for that. But I do know that it is true and it's authentic in me. So when I grew up, my mom and my dad were both war vets. My dad was World War II in the Navy, and my mom was with a volunteer at the Red Cross. And subsequently, the two of them did battle with alcohol. And sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
was pretty chaotic for my brother and I. They were good people. They were wonderful people. We felt love, but it was chaos.
Sure.
And I say that too because um, what those circumstances for probably 8 years taught me, or 10 years taught me, was that I could rely on my brother could rely on me. I would be very creative in terms of my resources, and guess what? I use that same mental thinking when I'm dealing with people. I believed in the
Mm-hmm.
power of myself and what I could do, and hence I kind of transfer that belief system when I'm actually dealing with people in states of crisis. It's no joke or it's no surprise as to why I ended up in the world that I'm in, because I think I was being groomed for that as I grew up, but not
Mm-hmm.
intentionally. Someone could
Sure.
say, "Oh, that's a horrible circumstance." Well, yeah, not people have lived through worse, but I guarantee I would not be the person that I am or doing what I'm doing had I not had a chance to understand those resources. So I think I'm
Right.
quite authentically a positive, glass half full guy. I did want to mention a couple of things, and that, and I
Yeah.
think that it's worthy of our time to consider it. Um, you mentioned a number of the crisis circumstances that we as a small corporation have been involved in and been doing it for years. Um, so I started my career, as you know, working in psychiatry with Holocaust survivors' grandchildren, so Auschwitz and Dachau and
Mm-hmm.
such. And no one was doing research on that, so I kind of came into the world, into the psychiatric world, through the window of trauma, and then
Right.
eventually became part of the health team for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I had a chance to work with a lot of Indian residential school survivors across the country. And you think, hmm, how can anyone feel in any way positive about that? So, without being in any way disparaging, my point is that with those individuals whom I had a privilege of meeting over the 37 years,
Mm-hmm.
what we talked about again and again and again were the resources that they learned about in their own lives, their own personal inner resources, their intellectual resources, their emotional resources. We talked about this earlier in the beginning of the interview,
Mm-hmm.
their community resources. One of the best
Right.
examples that we have ever encountered in our country in recent times came was brought to our attention through a book called "The Day the World Came to Town." And if people have not read it, I believe it should be required reading for every student in our country. But
Mm.
it spoke to the concept or what actually took place in Gander, Newfoundland after 9/11. We all know it has
Right.
come from away now. But because I work in Gander and I work in Gander frequently with the aviation industry, I know many of those people. I was heading up the largest Canadian team from 9/11, so I know that end of it as well. Spent months there. But that
Right.
was one of the best examples of how it is that people come together where they might not have. Invite perfect strangers into their fold and take care of them because that's a natural inclination. Gander's an amazing place.
Mm-hmm.
But we see this time and time and time again throughout the globe. Not just Canadian, it's not just North
Sure.
American. Throughout the globe, we see that where people will come together and support one another. And that's when we're at our best. I truly believe.
Right.
Does that make any sense to you?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that you touched on a few points that are important. And one of it is that, well, the optimism that you have is it's real, like it's authentic. And I don't think you could survive in your industry as long as you do without it. It would just be, just too overwhelming, and the fake positivity would soon be overshot. Um, but the other point was that, in terms of like personal resources, like you believe in your own ability to manage and deal with these situations, even if you're not exactly sure how, you're willing to take that step to be like, okay, let me try this, let me consider this possibility and see how we can make something work or do whatever it is. And so, just on a side point, like, what would you say is the most intense crisis that you've had to deal with, and why?
Most intense.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess that's a bit of a loaded question. I guess, excuse me, I mean more like, you know, like different crises have different problems and different responses and things like that. But what was one of them? And, like what, do you have any like stories about, like in 9/11, for example, like that was something that shook the world,
okay.
right? It wasn't like it wasn't a normal kind of crisis. Just like COVID is something that's shaken the world, right? And it's affected everybody. Nobody isn't affected by it. It's just a matter of how, right? So, like, okay, so let's start like this. When you got how did you get the call for after 9/11 happened? Who phoned you, or how
Um,
did you get
had
called in, and what
previously
was it
done
for?
some work for an employee assistance program, and through that program, I began to respond to significant corporate crises. So it would,
Mm.
and the corporations, I think, started to know what we were doing, and equally as important, what I was doing, because I was always at the helm of those. There weren't many people at that time who organized major crisis response for corporations. And
Right.
so it was just a couple of years before that I was heading a team to Istanbul, Turkey. And I would probably say that that was one of the most intense crisis circumstances I've ever dealt with in my life. And
Okay.
so those things, I guess, in our world or in the corporate world, makes news. So, and I'll talk about Istanbul a little bit because it may help to understand, what happens when we're faced with
Yeah.
these major crises personally, as well as with the corporations we're helping. Um, but having said that, I do believe the corporate world is a small world, and more importantly, the corporate HR world is a small world. In as much
Hmm.
as I work and our teams work a lot with emergency services, that wasn't our the request for service that came in. There were many,
Sure.
many, many corporations, obviously, within those two towers or three towers, if you look at the financial tower as well, uh, Tower
Hmm.
3. And so many of them, like Coca-Cola or Deutsche Bank or, the Procter and Gambles of the world and such, um, they needed to have someone come in and work directly with the employees and the family members and those family members who had lost others and so on. They didn't know where to go. So I got that call, probably, or our organization got that call probably around 11:15 that morning. And there were a series
Right.
of calls. One called, and then
And then you
they
flew
let the
out.
other CEOs know that Tibbo and his team or this organization could come in. So by the time we were done, we probably helped about, we were there to assist about 12 different corporations. So,
Wow. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, it is crazy. Sorry, just to like point out that like, I mean, if you had an office there,
yeah,
as a big or small company in one of the towers or the buildings rather, and all of a sudden it's just gone, and a large portion of your staff might be dead too, and it's like what? It's just it's almost unimaginable for someone running a company to be like, what do I do? Everything's just gone. Even if it's a massive company, it's like it's huge, and it'll affect the employees everywhere in the company because it's people feel connected to it. So
mhm,
yeah, I just wanted to point out how
yeah.
insane it must have been for those people to have that happen to them.
Well, and I think it's a very good word to use because when we think about sanity, we think about those things that we know that are consistent and predictable around us. And then it feels
Hmm.
like the insane is the stuff that we don't fully understand. They come out of left field. No one obviously could have expected that. And
Right.
and I'm just talking with those individuals within those buildings. Where it becomes much more
Yeah.
personal is where an individual packs up and they go off to work in the morning. They kiss their husband or their wife or their partner and say, "I'll see you at the end of the day." And as per usual, they drive away or hop on the subway or whatever it is, say goodbye to the kids if there are kids in the house, and they think it's like any other day.
Right.
And so the 11th would be just like the 10th as far as they were concerned. And
Yeah.
then lo and behold, the world is turned completely upside down because of the decisions that other people made and the circumstances that occurred. Um, and
And it's just like
that's where it
that.
becomes a crisis. What's that?
Yeah. No, I say it's just like
It
that.
is.
It's
It is
just
within instance.
one
Yeah.
second. Yeah.
Um, there is. I want to. So again, New York was a very good example of how it
Yeah.
is that people came together, and it became the foundation of our knowledge and our understanding in my field of the fact that we can, in some way, thank goodness, depend on and count on the fact that people will come together. I believe it's as natural as
Right.
anything else, the formation of community. Um, I want to go back to, because sometimes
Yeah.
corporations, this is a really important point. When we think about communities, we think about clusters of people, different housing areas, and so on, and that is very
Sure.
much a community. Periodically, corporations, good corporations, can serve that role. And probably one of the best examples is the most significant crisis that I had ever dealt with, and that was back in 1999. It seems like forever now, but it became an important foundation for me and for our organization and for people in the field. So there was an earthquake that occurred in Istanbul, or was outside in Izmit, and an estimated 40,000 people died. So think about 40,000 people.
Jesus.
When Janet and I first moved our
Devastating.
community in Newmarket, Ontario, years ago, there were 32,000 people. That would mean the entire community plus 8,000 people would have died. And so we get called
Yeah.
upon by Procter & Gamble Corporation to go in to try and provide support for their people. They lost about 270 people of their thousands of staff. I don't know how many they had.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would have had family members die and so on. So the community itself, I was paying a little bit less attention to the community of Istanbul. And, we had hired many people from around the world who were Turkish speaking and Turkish origin to come and support us. I remember flying over the Atlantic and saying to myself, my God, Bill, are you sure you want to do this? You've never responded to an earthquake before. Never been anything so large. You don't even speak the language. You've never been in a community that was at that time still terrorist driven. It's absolutely insane. But an interesting thing occurred because that organization responded as a community. I brag about them all the time, simply because the people within that organization made sure that their staff and their family members and their kids were taken care of. The grandparents were taken care of. The aunts and uncles were taken care of.
Right.
They were housed. They were fed. There was the money made available. They did it all, but they also kept their eye on the greater community. They didn't really need to do that. Some would say, it would help their brand. I know. They did that because it was the right thing to do. So,
Right. Amazing.
Greatest crisis I'd ever dealt with. Even more significant in terms of numbers than 9/11. But probably the greatest window of opportunity for me to see the positive side of humanity.
Right.
And that's enriching for me to witness that.
Mm-hmm.
And people, it's not because Bill Tibbo says you need to do this. No. People are doing that because that's almost a natural instinct, a propensity for them to do.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, to think about how you just get in, a matter of, just on a normal day, just something happens, massive earthquake, and now you have 40,000 dead bodies. Now, I mean, just like, never mind how you deal with that, how the people deal with it, like it's almost unimaginable. I mean, I think it is unimaginable unless you were part of it or you went there and experienced it, right? But as you say, like, people will commune and they will take care of each other. But so here's where an interesting thought that came to mind is that, to bring it back to like COVID, right? I've seen just from my exposure and whatever it is that there's a huge amount of community response, but there's also a huge amount of conflict that's happening between people and it's weird because it's like everyone is trying to do the right thing. It's just what the right thing is is different, but what people think the right thing to do is different. And then they want to, prescribe that to other people. And so the conflict is almost inevitable, but when it's at such a large scale. But so how do you deal with different people's responses in terms of how best to help other people, because it's like everyone thinks that whatever their view is right? And whatever, whether it is or isn't is a different point, but it's like Well, when that conflicts with other people, you have two people who are both trying to help, but are now butting heads because they can't see eye to eye because they believe that the right thing to do is different for different people and different reasons, you know? I mean, a simple example is just like how there's different views about lockdown. And now, you know, regardless of whether, regardless of the fact of the matter, it's like you have one side of people who are like, no, we need a lockdown because that's how you protect people. And then you have other people who are like, but the lockdowns are killing people as well. And I'm not, you know, advocating for one side over another. I'm just saying how everyone is like, no, but this is what will be best for the people. And they are trying to help, but they're butting heads and it's almost like unresolvable until it just something plays out, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Is that like
figure out how I can bring my own experience and we'll call it, for lack of a better word, kind of foundation of understanding to the question. But if we take a look at I don't know if we call them polar positions, because they sometimes they are polar opposites, but in fact they may not be. Once again, maybe a good approach to informing this question is through kind of an anecdote, if I can. So
yeah, stories are the best.
yeah, well, I think that to me, I learned so much from the archives in here and the archives around me. So I go back to, and in the beginning, we all started to do these comparisons between the SARS epidemic and COVID. And it doesn't take a guy like me to remind us that there are some similarities, but to an extent they're worlds away. So I was very, very involved with Scarborough Grayson General and North York General. Then they represented the epicenters of the SARS epidemic, and we can call it phase 1 and phase 2. And for us at that time, that was a very, very significant circumstance, and we lost lives and so on. But there's a point that I wanted to raise, an observation that came from that has played itself out again, that speaks of two very important positions that people are taking, and neither of them are really wrong on an emotional, social level. So there were people in the hospitals at that time, and they might have been in the hospitals for, let's think about things that are quite significant. So someone could be in a palliative position in a hospital, or someone could be delivering a baby. So we'll have the beginning and the end of life. And what our natural propensity when it comes to those types of events is families want to be with that individual who's celebrating the beginning of life, or we'll use this term, kind of celebrating the end of life. And yet we were not allowed to go in to see people, or more importantly, the general public could not. I still remember clearly standing out in front of some of those hospitals when family members were crying and trying to beg the authorities to let them in because their father or their mother was dying. On countless occasions, they didn't have a chance to be able to see that. Or I still remember having a conversation with some grandparents who were so enthusiastic about the fact that their daughter was about to have their very first grandchild, and they wanted to be there because they dreamt about it their entire life. So we have those people who are kind of pushing to say, those rules don't make any sense to me. I want to be able to go when I need to be able to do this. I want to be with my family.
Yeah.
And then you'll have the authorities who are attempting to try and figure out the science behind this, who are setting a principle and saying, no, we can't allow you to do it. In many ways, both positions are right.
Yeah.
We're trying to keep the general public safe, absolutely, and everyone knows that. And the other position is right also, that I should be there with my daughter. I should be there with my husband as he's passing. And so it isn't so much a question of right and wrong, and it isn't even it appears to be a debate, and it feels like a debate. As they say, a duck by end, or the name is still a duck. It's still a debate.
Yeah.
But you've got, and where it is very different is both impassioned positions have place in this. So back to your question, what is it that I do? Well, again, I'm not going to be able to resolve social challenges like
Sure,
COVID.
yeah.
I'm not smart enough to do that. It's not my position to do that. But I am in a position, like you are,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to stimulate conversation and to
Right.
get people to be able to talk about those positions. And on countless occasions, we do a lot of consulting with the Ontario Association of Cemetery and Funeral Workers.
Mm.
You can appreciate they have been through an awful lot, where
Crazy.
families are upset because they haven't had a chance to be able to celebrate the life of someone who's passed.
Right.
Then the staff and the owners of these organizations have very strict rules and regulations they have to stick to. So how do you
Yeah.
get those two to converse?
Like 10-person funerals, you know?
Exactly. And in the months that we've been locked down or immersed in COVID or you know,
Yeah.
smothered by COVID, there have been many, many, many people who have lost loved ones directly because of COVID and
Mm-hmm.
indirectly. And our natural instinct, it's interesting how you started off talking about, in the Jewish community, how natural it is for people to come together,
Yeah.
bring food and so on. Hopefully at the end of this, you and I will figure out why it is it's food that we bring, um, but
Right.
either way, that's natural for us.
Yeah.
But it's also natural for us to want to protect and save everybody. And, so where we have these two factions, again, I use poles. I don't think they are poles. These two
Yeah.
factions, both with very strong, valid opinions. We need to get them to talk.
Right.
And once again, I don't want people to misunderstand my role because I'm not out there doing that, but I'm helping to kind of structure some of those conversations, even in family systems.
Sure. Just high level discussion that we're talking about, you know?
Yeah, yeah. The point is that what I've learned is that in any of those situations, whether you're talking about COVID or you're talking about, Fort McMurray fires and some of the challenges that occurred there, or you're talking about, any other major crisis, you're going to have people who have varying opinions.
Mm.
And we're always, I don't know why we do this, we always strive to try and figure out which one is right.
Right.
You know, and in the circumstances that I was talking about around SARS, and we've seen the same thing in COVID, to an extent, both are right.
Right.
And both need to be given voice.
And I think people look for what's right because they want to know what to do.
True.
And they want to know how to, like, this is just what I think about it. It's just, it would make sense to me where people are like, there's so many options available out there of like beliefs that it's like, well, I want to know which is the right one so that I can do that, so that it offers the most amount of help or benefit, or it offers me and my family the best chance of survival. And if there's conflict about it and no one's willing to talk because it's so emotionally involved, it becomes a very difficult topic to navigate, right?
Yeah. If we distill it down to some of the most basic and foundational relationships that we have, it might be a spousal relationship, a partner relationship, it could be parents with their teenage kids. And both will enter into that, and those would be very common conversations that I'll have with people in my private practice. Once again, both positions are right, and yet when
Sure.
people enter into it, it is that they are trying to convince the other person that their position is wrong and theirs is right, and they need to be able to adopt that way of looking at things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fraught with potential fractures
Yeah.
if we approach it from that point of view. So if, for example, we're able to help that parental team understand the passion of that 15 or 16-year-old son or daughter, and why it is that they're pushing for something
Mm-hmm.
and they're pushing for something else. If we get them to listen, and I mean truly listen,
Right.
sometimes it may be that people agree to disagree. It may be that there's a greater understanding that is now, there's a greater illumination of one party's view versus another. Um, I feel like I'm going to be digressing a little bit, but I want to go back to something that occurred for me personally
Sure.
when I was about 13 years old. And it's only because my mother reported this to me that I bet you I've told this story 50 times in my lifetime if I've told it once, but it's meant something to me.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad, as I mentioned, was a military man. As much as he had his struggles with alcohol periodically, he was, as I said, a good man, very loving and engaged man. So we lived in a small little townhouse in New Brunswick. And on one occasion, my dad and I were sitting at the kitchen table, and my father made a comment. I guess we were in a bit of a debate.
Mm-hmm.
And he said something that sounded so traditional. Again, I'm 60 years old, so you can do the math.
Right.
So 47 years ago, I'm sitting there at that table. My father looks at me and he said to me, "Now you listen to me, young man." Now back then, that might have been a relatively common phrase. And, to be able to say, I'm the authority in this household. My opinion counts.
Yeah.
I bet you, as parents, we might have all said that at one point in time. So what did I say as a 13-year-old? I said, "No, Dad, you listen to me." Now
Yeah.
imagine that.
I'm sure that
I'm
went
telling
well.
a military officer,
Yeah.
"No, you listen to me." That's
Uh,
pretty
I'm,
brave.
yeah, I'm
And my
sure that went
mother's
well for you.
knees are shaking. My mom was just quaking, thinking, "Oh my goodness, what's going to happen here?"
Right.
And my father did the wise thing, and he sat back in his chair. I remember this. And he said, "Okay, tell me." And I explained my position.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it is not lost on me that I was a 13-year-old kid having this
Yeah.
conversation with his dad. And my dad sat back and he listened, and then he paused at the end and he said, "You know what? I understand. You're right, Bill. I understand." And and that was it. It was the end of the conversation. And it was kind of like, "We're good. Yeah, we're great. Fantastic."
Yeah.
Typical of me, I would get up and I gave him a hug and a kiss on the cheek, and I said, "Dad, I got to get out. The boys are playing some hockey." And that was it.
Right.
When I left the room, apparently my mom said that my dad looked at her and said, "Oh my God, is he ever growing up?" So, what's the lesson learned that was a carryover for me is that, first of all, in a lot of the conflicts that we have, we never ever take the time to try and understand or at least listen to the other person's position.
Yeah.
And where it doesn't necessarily need to be, or excuse me, we don't need to be convinced of the other person's opinion. We just need to be able to try and understand it. And knowing that position might help us to better kind of calm the debate a little bit and even allow us a little bit of malleability and flexibility in that relationship.
Right.
Crisis circumstances, sometimes, Shane, the crisis circumstances force that dialogue.
Yeah.
If we're wise, we'll allow it to force the dialogue. And so those conflictual positions I talked about earlier on, were people actually able to go in and see their loved ones? They weren't. They weren't able to do it because
Yeah.
ministry policy and health would say we can't. But there were times where those same doctors and nurses who were having to tell the loved ones that they couldn't see them, they were in tears themselves
Yeah.
because they
Because
knew
they,
for
yeah.
my loved one, I want to be there, but they also knew that they need to keep people alive.
Yeah.
So
Terrible decisions.
difficult decisions, absolutely. But if not for that conversation, the parent, grandparent looking to see the baby,
Yeah.
the spouse looking to see her husband, would not ever guess that that doctor, that nurse, that administrator really gets it. But
Yeah.
because they
They
have a
they see them
conversation,
as an enemy.
yeah, and then they see them as a human.
Yeah. And
Human.
I think it's the empathy that's the what the key part of it. And when there is like empathic failure, um, because of high emotion or just, not taking the time to listen, like then there's no conversation to be had. But as you say, it's when people are able to just listen and truly listen to what the other person is saying and where they're coming from, that's when there's a connection, because there's understanding that can come through that, right? And then the two polar opposites don't seem so polar anymore. They're just people trying to make the best of what they've got to deal with, right? And the decisions that they have to make.
And we have the capacity to do that as human beings. We do, if we choose to.
Definitely.
When Janet and I had our 30th anniversary about 3 years ago, we went to Hawaii and we met a couple there. And we were out on the beach and we seemed to get along really well. And eventually he said, well, why don't you guys come out and go to a beer? Like, there's a brewery around here. I'll go and get a micro beer. So we did. We sat down and we enjoyed our conversation. And then we went out and had some dinner a bit later. And I'm the least political guy you'll ever meet in your entire life.
Yeah, me too.
We were sitting there and we were talking, and I discovered that they were Republicans from the United States. And Janet and I are just probably not of that ilk at all. And the other part of it is that they were gun rights supporters. And again, it's not the thing that Janet and I would probably support, but either way.
Yeah.
And there was this very, very slight, and I emphasize slight, pause at the table when we discovered our different positions.
Mm-hmm.
And then he looked at me and I looked at him, and we said, does that make any difference? I said, not really.
Yeah.
And meaning that we started to talk about our marriages. We talked about our children who were evolving and becoming adults. We talked about our priorities in life and how hard we worked and how we tried to teach our children right from wrong. And we had such an enjoyable evening talking about those things we all had in common, whereas that could have stopped us in our path. So it's almost like the two people outside of that hospital who never bothered to talk, we'd never understand what the commonality was.
Right.
Right? Does it make any sense to you that part of the thing that continues to attract me to do what I do and have done for almost 40 years and will continue to do is the fact that as someone comes in to see me or I go to see them, there are many, many, many more similarities between us than there are dissimilarities.
100%, yeah.
There but for could be me.
Yeah, I think that the overwhelming majority of people are similar in certain fundamental ways about being human and wanting to live the best life for themselves and generally for others and for their kids, and just do the best they can with what they got. And it totally makes sense to me that one of the parts that attracts you is discovering that with people, right? And enabling the conversation that people might not be willing to have without some kind of mediator or something like that there, because for whatever reason, right? But that when it comes down to it, yeah, you can be friends, you can be good friends with someone who's got very different beliefs to you, and that's fine. And you can have conversation, and you don't have to convince the other person of anything, right? You can just be like, let me just explain where I'm coming from. I'll listen to where you're coming from. Maybe I'll learn some stuff. Maybe nothing changes. But either way, there's so much more that we have in common in terms of, as you say, just like being a family and wanting the best for our children and our societies and things like that. And maybe our opinions differ on how that exactly will go. But that's okay, because we're all different people, right? And we're gonna have different views like that. And so I think that it's a really, and I think it's a good point for us to end on here today as well, is that conversation can happen and you can be friends or involved with or whatever with people who have different opinions to you, and that's okay. And you can allow them to have their opinions and they can allow you to have yours. And then through that discussion, and through, empathizing with the other person and listening and not trying to overpower them with something you disagree with, or, you know, interrupting people in conversation because they made a point that doesn't sit well with you. It's like, whatever, just let them have their point. Like, it's not going to affect you. Just, you know, hear them out, and then afterwards you can be like, okay, well, maybe I disagree with this point, but that's fine. There's stuff I do that you're going to disagree with, and that's fine too. Like, that's the diversity of the world, which is beautiful, right? And I think that, like, you know, for COVID and things like that, like, it is important to have conversations with people. And I know it's a bit tired now at this point in time. Like, people are a bit sick of talking about it, but you can't really be at the point where, if you're trying to get things done, like, there needs to be conversation to resolve anything, right? Otherwise, there's just, you know, things come together and then they'll just separate and be at war with each other. And the only way is to really allow people to have their views, but still engage them in some significant conversation and empathy. You know, I think that's just be empathetic to other people. They've come from such a different world to you. You don't know what they're feeling or what they're going through, what they're thinking. And if you give them a chance to explain it to you, then you might learn something, right?
Well, I think that we spend, even in some of these discussions, we spend too much time thinking about the differences between us.
Yeah.
When I truly believe that there are far, far, far more similarities.
Definitely.
All we need to do is go to two places in order to find this out. Go to a high school or a university graduation, and you'll have thousands of people there, all with different views, all celebrating with tears in their eyes as their child crosses.
Yeah.
Or you need to go to a nursery and a hospital and watch as parents and grandparents come and look in the window. And it doesn't matter what their race is, doesn't matter what their color is, doesn't matter what their political beliefs are, doesn't matter any of that. And they'll all be sitting there in awe and crying. And there are more things that are common than there are differences, even in times like this.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that we always need to, that becomes the foundation of any great discussion.
Yeah. And it's just, you're right, it's just coming together in the celebration of life, you know?
What in common?
Yeah. And you're right, there's definitely so much more that we have in common with everyone than we are different. Mm-hmm. Anyway, listen, Bill, it's been a pleasure as always to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been an honor, Shane, and great to see you again.
You as well.
I really enjoyed this conversation, so thank you.
Me too. Thanks. And I'll put links to your website and your team's website in the description of the audio, the video that people watch, so that they can check you out if they want.
They can ask questions if they need to. So.
All right. Thanks again. Hey. All right.
Now.
Bye.